Hey, everybody. Today we are starting to take a look at the uh, part two of our struggle for equality. You guys just took a test on part one, and so we're going to dive into taking a look at the American Indian struggle for equality here today. So here we go. All right, the American Indian experience. Let's full screen this and get to it here. All right. So, a little bit of world history background, right? First Americans coming in during the last ice age. Of course, they're coming across these glacier areas. This area here, going from Asia, or what is now Alaska, or yeah, Asia, into what is now Alaska here, and on down. So, over the course of thousands and thousands of years, you have people that are spreading out into different people groups. They develop different languages, different religions, really just different ways of life based on the physical geography and the climate where they're living. Over time, these people groups get established and really set up their own really nations essentially with their own leadership structures and everything like that. Enter in Europeans coming across the Atlantic Ocean and really stumbling upon, from their perspective, stumbling upon this new area. And with that, they're bringing all sorts of things with them as they enter this land, and the arrogance that Europeans bring with them. And they essentially decide that they're going to overtake this land where people are already living. And so we see the use of enslaved labor through this. We see the spread of diseases, new diseases coming into America through this, this idea of encroachment of land. And there are some of these American Indian groups that are welcoming, that are helpful in this process. You're going to read an article on one group like that in a little bit, but there have others that are very much resisting this practice. So out of this time period, we do get a pretty famous story about a woman by the name of Pocahontas. So we're going to skip ahead here, and I'm going to play this video a little bit more on Pocahontas here and who she really was.
In 1613, Pocahontas becomes the colony's unlikely savior. She's visiting the nearby Patawomic tribe when her Indian hosts, threatened with war by an English ship captain, lure her onto his vessel and betray her. The English demand a ransom of hostages and stolen weapons, which goes only partially paid. Negotiations will drag on for more than a year. Pocahontas is the currency that pays for the colony's survival. Inside the fort walls, in this English world, Pocahontas, the Powhatan woman, is remade. She's important as a piece of collateral, but she is also seen as a soul ripe for conversion. Baptizing Pocahontas was the first step in converting the Powhatan nation. Over the months in captivity, she is instructed in the Anglican faith, and she becomes the first indigenous person to convert to Christianity in the English New World. She is baptized Rebecca,
which
a
I
soul
command
saved
you this day,
that helped the
that ye
English
may
justify
be
the moral
strong
correctness
and go
of
in
colonization.
upon the earth.
While a hostage in Jamestown, she meets a wealthy planter named John Rolfe. Rolfe is clearly smitten. The governor grants his permission, and they marry on April 5th, 1614. Pocahontas's marriage also had political ramifications. As Governor Thomas Dale wrote in 1614, it ushered in a period known as the Pocahontas Peace.
Powhatan's daughter is since married to an English gentleman of good understanding. Another knot to bind this peace the stronger.
The royal hostage had become a bride, and a diplomat putting the colony on steady ground. In 1616, Pocahontas boards an English ship for the second time. It is captained by the very same man who kidnapped her just 3 years before. But on this voyage, she is an honored guest of the Virginia Company, setting sail for London.
So all throughout the 1500s, Europeans were thinking of indigenous peoples as cannibals, as idolaters, as brutish, and most of all, as being irredeemably non-Christian. Okay, enter Pocahontas. She is none of these things.
In London, all things Virginia are the rage. Pocahontas arrives to find herself very much in fashion.
She took Europe by storm. She shows up speaking English in Elizabethan garb. She shows up as a Christian wife. She shows up as somebody who was invited to the court of King James. So Pocahontas right away becomes somebody that Europeans can relate to and they can understand.
I think a lot of times when we think of Pocahontas, we think about the Disney version, and you don't see really how she was used as a tool to bridge a relationship between Europeans and at least one of these American Indian tribes here in the New World. All right, let's back this up here to where we were. All right. So a lot of this is review, but we've got this idea of manifest destiny coming in here. And with that, we see a couple of different ways that these Native American Indian groups respond to this. One way that they respond is violently. You see this violent resistance to anyone that is trying to take over their land. So probably the biggest example of this is this man right here. His name is Tecumseh. Tecumseh really did support the British in both the American Revolution as well as in the War of 1812. And the reason why is the British had promised that they would get their own land back. Now, the reason why Tecumseh is a big deal is because he didn't just lead his own people, but he really brought together many different American Indian nations, and together they fought against settlement and kind of pushing back against Americans pushing into the new territories. So in the end, Tecumseh ends up dying in a battle in the War of 1812, and after that, his confederacy of all these groups kind of falls apart. But it really is one of the only times that we see a true alliance between a lot of these Native American groups. So that's more that violent resistance movement. The other side would be the kind of this idea of peaceful assimilation. So assimilation meaning you're going to become like those around you. And this man right here, his name was Sequoyah, is an example of that. Sequoyah was part of the Cherokee Nation, which was primarily located in the southeastern part of the United States. And essentially the Cherokee people decided that they're going to transition their traditional ways of life and shift their culture more towards what they were seeing from the Europeans. And so they began settlements, started villages, they began agricultural practices, they formed their own education system, and Sequoyah is credited for creating the written language of the Cherokee. So before this time, the Cherokee had their own language, but it wasn't written down. They really had no reason or need to write information down. But now, as they're becoming more assimilated to European culture, they find a need for that. And so Sequoyah basically took the verbal language of the Cherokee and created a written form for it. And so that's an example of that peaceful assimilation. Regardless of these different groups, most Americans are going to look at all American Indian nations and people as terrorists. There is no distinction between the differences of the tribes and how they're reacting to certain situations or what their individual goals are. Any sort of Native American is seen as someone that is trying to stop white settlement and potentially injure white settlers on the frontier. All right. Now we do have in Wisconsin, you probably know with your Wisconsin history, right? We do know a decent number of areas around here are tied to some of these early groups. So we have things like effigy mounts throughout different parts of the state. We have this area called Aztlan. Formerly, it was actually named when they thought the Aztecs had come up here. That wasn't true at all. It was a group called the Mississippians that kind of had formed this area. This is a burial mound outside of their city that they had created. But you can still see that kind of by Lake Mills today as well. So we still have lots of evidence around where we live of these different areas. Oops. All right. So the time period that we're going into here is the 1830s and 1840s. And I just want you to pause for a second here and kind of think, what are some of the other things that we know about that happened during this time period? Because we've actually covered quite a bit. This is about 20 or 30 years before the start of the Civil War. So a few things that come to mind when I think about this, 1830s and 1840s. One, you have the expansion of slavery, right? Slavery is spreading faster in the South than any other time period. A lot of it's because of the production of cotton and the demand for that. Also in the 1830s and 1840s, you have a ton of people moving into this country from Europe. And a lot of reasons why they're coming here is to avoid some of the violence that's happening in their home countries, but also they're coming for job opportunities. They're coming here because they heard that there's an opportunity to make a better life for yourself here. So you have a massive amount of immigrants coming in to this country. And one of the things they're looking for are jobs, places to live, land, those types of things. Also during this time period, we have really the increasing division, the sectionalism between the North and the South over the issue of slavery and where people are going to live and those types of things. And the last thing I'm going to say is we have a massive amount of this idea of manifest destiny. So people pushing west, taking over territories for themselves. So really, if you look at the 1830s and 40s, the nation's in flux. It's changing. We're still a relatively new country. We hadn't even really been a country for more than about 50 years at that point, and we're still figuring out who we are and what we mean, and we're making a lot of decisions that are going to set up a lot of what is coming down the line, 50 years, 100 years, or more down the line. Now, in this time period is a local war where we see some very tense and violent situations between American Indians and settlers and therefore the military at the time, the U.S. military. So this is the Black Hawk War. And in 1832, it takes place in the summer of 1832. So it really starts in June and kind of wrapped up by August here. And essentially what happens here is the Sauk people, like so many other areas, had kind of been tricked into signing a treaty that's going to force them away from their home territories, which are kind of this part that I'm circling here of Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And they're kind of forced over the Mississippi River into what's now Iowa. Now, at the time, the guy that they had signing the treaty for the Sauk really had no authority to do so. He was not in a leadership position to make those sorts of decisions for the people. But despite that, they were forced off their land. They did move over there. But when they got over there, they quickly realized that they were not going to be able to be self-sufficient. They had a hard time growing the crops that they had been used to growing. The government was not following through with the payment and the promises that they had been received. So in reaction to that, Black Hawk, which was one of the leaders of the Sauk, essentially said, this treaty is broken. We haven't received payment for this treaty and for our land, so therefore we're going to go back home. We're going to go back to our land. And so they start by June to move back into their original territory. Now, in the meantime, the time that they had left, all sorts of people had moved into this territory, white settlers and immigrants and all sorts of people were moving in. And so you can see here there's going to be some tension between these two groups. Now, Black Hawk knew that some violence could happen, but he wasn't really looking for a war with him. He brought their entire community, so the older people, women, children, everybody kind of going along. And what happens as a result is essentially the military is not recognizing that they had broken the treaty, and violence breaks out, and you can see the number of battles that happen throughout the summer here. From the U.S. perspective, they had felt that Black Hawk was illegally re-entering their territory, and so he had to be kind of pushed out of this area. The American troops at the time were led by a guy by the name of General George Atkinson, and Fort Atkinson is named after him later on. And a few other people that we see in this are Jefferson Davis, was an officer in this war, and later he will become the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And then Abraham Lincoln does a very short stint in the Illinois militia, and he is part of this Black Hawk War as well. He never sees any action, but we do see that he had some connections to this territory. In fact, he actually stayed right on, he camped on Lake Koshkonong, but kind of stayed over on Clear Lake as well, and over by Storrs Lake as well. So if you go to the Milton House and you go down Storrs Lake Road, there's actually one of those Wisconsin historical kind of placards on the side there of the building, and it talks about how Abraham Lincoln probably stayed right on Storrs Lake in this time period where they're kind of traveling in June and July of 1832. So anyway, you can find that information there. Now, eventually, by the time we get to the end of the war, you can see they're moving their way along this route here. By the time we get to the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, it's pretty terrible, and the American military is pretty ruthless to Black Hawk and his people. You see at the Battle of Bad Axe really what equates to be a massacre, as Black Hawk and his people are just trying to get people back across the Mississippi River. And as they're retreating, you have the military opening fire on them and people dying in the river. And it's a really bad situation. But eventually they're forced out, and that's kind of it. As far as the surrender for Black Hawk, here's a couple of things here. The surrender for Black Hawk here. I think we'll go back and watch this if I can get there. We'll watch this video here that'll talk about the surrender. It's kind of an interesting story what they do with Black Hawk after this as well.
Was already a symbol of Native American resistance when he surrendered to American forces east of the Mississippi in southern Wisconsin in August of 1832. But when President Andrew Jackson summoned him to Washington, D.C. 8 months later, he became a national celebrity. Large, curious crowds greeted the Lion of the West at every turn of the long steamboat, rail, and carriage journey he and his lieutenants made under guard from Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri. Front-page newspaper stories detailed every stop on the way, offering lengthy descriptions of Black Hawk's dignified presence, as well as gushing comparisons of his son with the Greek god Apollo. When Jackson sent them to Fort Monroe, the crowds followed, with thousands arriving by steamboat to see the Indians and the immense bastion the president hoped would show them America's immense military power. What resulted was a nationally noted tourist boom that helped turn Old Point Comfort and the Hygeia Hotel, which was already known for the hospitality it had shown to Jackson on previous visits, into a burgeoning resort. The president was very familiar with Fort Monroe. He'd visited here several times, and he wanted Black Hawk to see it for a reason, said Casemate Museum historian Robert Kelly, citing the fort's giant ramparts and guns. That visit became national news. Every headline of every story included the name of the place where Black Hawk was imprisoned.
All right.
So on Saturday, approximately around...
Stop. All right. So kind of an interesting background. And this happened more than once, where you have people that are, capturing these leaders, and then they kind of parade them around America almost as like a tourist sideshow type attraction here. So, yeah, kind of a harsh situation here. Now, despite how this ended, what's interesting, I think, for our local region here is that in Rock County, Black Hawk has kind of become this legacy of places here. Even though he really, from the American military perspective, was seen as an invader, and that we had defeated him and his people, there's almost a legacy of honor today, and we see that throughout our community. I think if you just sit and think about it, there are all sorts of ways that Black Hawk is honored in our community today. So as we wrap this up, when you get to your note sheet here, I want you to just to take a second and think about where do you see this legacy in our local community today? All right, sounds good. Now, finish up the iPuzzle, and then when you're done, make sure you flip back if you haven't already and fill out your note sheet so you have this info as well. All right, we'll see you guys soon.